We have a quorum. I'm going to call this meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Shonda, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I'm going to open this up for any public comments from our last session. No. Okay. And if everyone has had an opportunity to review the minutes, I'd like for someone to make a motion to approve.
I would just have one change on the second page, the third paragraph down. I think it's an important word change that the sentence starts with the 2022 ballot language to be dispersed among the committee for review, and then it goes on to say committee members report having a strategic framework, essentially this time will be a positive, the word is committee trust as it's written, but it's supposed to be community trust. So I just think that's a important word change. We're talking about what the community did and didn't believe about the 2020 ballot. And then I will move for approval as that word is changed.
Second,
Second.
motion carried. Call for a vote to approve. Everybody say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Carried. Go ahead, Josh.
Thank you, Ms. Hunter. Mr. Davis, turn it over to you for a staff update.
Okay. We'll do a brief overview of our departments. And just a quick overview of how we're organized and what we've been working on, and then I'll have a couple people talk to you about community engagement. So because we're a new department, I tried to simplify this so that folks would kind of get a good understanding of how we're organized and what we do. And I call it the 1, 2, 3, 4 of housing and neighborhood revitalization. And that is one team with 2 priorities divided into 3 divisions, for lack of a better word, with 4 functions. And I'll run that down real quick. One team with 2 priorities, that's creating the county's housing plan and managing the county's ARPA funds. Our 3 groups or divisions are administrative, grant management, and programming. And those are pretty self-explanatory. Grant management is actually the technicalities of managing federal grant dollars, and programming is creating all the programs that go out into the community. And our 4 functions are policy and planning, and that has to do with housing market statistics, collecting market data, and policy implementation once council has made a decision. So that's policy and planning. Grant management, again, self-explanatory. And then our programs come in 2 forms, which are housing programs and community programs. And our housing programs will be informed by the plan that this committee eventually signs off on. And our community programs are what we are spending ARPA funds on. And the focus of that in a lot of cases is going to be neighborhood stabilization, because the houses that we are trying to get built will be in neighborhoods. So we want to pay attention to, we want to take a holistic approach to that kind of thing. So other than putting all of our administrative things in place, our primary focus has been the 2 programs that have been approved by council so far, which is micro business pandemic relief and nonprofit pandemic relief. Those applications have been received, reviewed, and will be going to council in June for approval. And hopefully we'll have checks out before the end of June for both of those programs. And then the rest of our public efforts, again, aside from administration, have been towards community engagement. And I'm going to put Margaret and Diamond on the spot, and you guys can get up and talk about our community engagement efforts.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Jefferson, a Community Engagement Specialist, and this is Diamond Curry. She's a program administrator for our housing program. Oh. Is this better? I'm a little tall, so I'm gonna have to adjust this mic here a little bit. A couple of things that we have been working on. One of the things that we're looking at is where the referendum didn't do well. So we're looking at mailers, to maybe just give some information. Everything's going to be information that our consultants has provided for us. And that kind of keeps the information, keeps things on the front of their minds about the housing crisis we have here in Charleston. We also have some community events that we will be attending in the community from now on through June. And then also we're working with our consultants to have community forums, and we're going to look at it established via Zoom with community executive directors or even government staff persons to find out what are their concerns as it relates to housing needs in their communities. Want to add anything, Jill?
Yeah. So we'll have the June calendar hopefully finalized by the end of next week. And then those dates will be sent to you all as well as posted on our Housing Our Future website. And then following, we want to plan July, prior to July, all the way through August.
Any questions?
And so, kind of walk me through these events. Are they more collecting or information sharing? What style are we doing, and how do these events kind of commingle with what we'll be doing in August, September, and October?
I can answer that one. So we're going to be going based off of some of the work that we did with the consultants in like February and March. So we split up some stakeholder groups and had roundtables with them. But now that we're a little more into the planning process, with some of those groups, we're going to be talking to them and letting them know that we have a plan and getting feedback for what they'll support and what they're interested in as far as affordable housing goes. But we'll also be doing just general outreach. So for example, we want to attend the Mount Pleasant Farmers Market, and that'll just to let people know that there is a plan, and also getting feedback from them as far as why they may have not supported affordable housing efforts in the county prior. So those will be just more general based engagement, and then it'll change and be more targeted hopefully in August when the consultants come to do their open houses.
And I'll add that our government to government community engagement, a meeting with all three of the larger jurisdictions as well as all of the smaller jurisdictions, basically trying to find out what they will and will not support. There's no, it could be the best tool in the world, but, if 1 out of 14 jurisdictions supports it, it's kind of a wasted effort. So we'll be meeting with the staffs and hopefully the administrators of the different towns and municipalities, and seeing if they'll get specific with us about which of the tools they will and will not support.
And is that before we've recommended the full report, or?
That will be well before the full report. We will not be able to get to everybody before the framework. But as they turn that framework into the first draft of the plan, we expect to have met with everybody and gotten their feedback before the first draft of the full plan.
And we're going to talk about the 2020 language and the potential mill increase. I mean, this conversation can be independent of those that you're describing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just want to make sure we're not doing anything that'll jeopardize the other work that y'all are doing. So
Yeah. We are just to be on this, so everybody can be clear. We are pretty much staying out of the election conversation.
Okay.
So unless we are instructed specifically to do something, by the county administrator's office, we are not engaging in any politicking towards the referendum.
Gotcha. Thank you. Any other questions for? Thank you, ladies.
Thank you. It's the Housing Our Future website. Yes, it's there's a link to it on our department webpage.
We'll wait for. Darrell will come back, make sure he's done with his.
All right. Before we move on,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I'm going to add our FOIA information to this. We'll have that language to you guys for future meetings. But because this is a public meeting, I want to give notice that this meeting has been properly noticed and posted on all relevant media sites and the website. And notice has been given to people requesting notice of this meeting. And then I'll make sure you guys have that language so you can give it at the beginning of the meeting from now on.
All right. Thank you. Anything else staff-wise or? Oh, well, thank you. Moving on, the next item we have is the Greenbelt structure. This was something that we discussed in some detail at our last meeting. Really, the idea of the Greenbelt was, what is the purpose of this committee? How do we reflect how other committees within the county umbrella are structured, and kind of what is our path forward, other than talking about ballot language and the strategic framework. So we had the Greenbelt program shared, and this is something that started back in 2004. Similar motion to where the voters were given a couple options as far as what the sales tax would be used for, and then there was also a obligation bond question that went forward. This ended up passing, and then from that, council created the structure of the Greenbelt Advisory Board. And kind of how it has been explained to me, the way this body was put together, it's supposed to mirror how the Greenbelt was set up. We would be the primary advisory board, very much the similar model of the GAB. And then the plan itself, which will come at a later date, would be reviewed with a timetable that we could set. Bless you. From there, I think it really kind of gets into the crux of, when we recommend the ballot language and how we want to go forward, having this structure in place where it's identifiable. We can point voters to this, but also other elected officials to this type of framework. But then also, having this model in place, it's not as if we're creating this out of thin air. There is a plan that's easy to replicate. And so kind of going forward, we kind of need to think about, what are the intended purposes of this committee. It's not simply to recommend the ballot language, but, kind of thinking a little bit down the line. With that in mind and how the Greenbelt was set up. I see Mr. Rant here. If you have anything you'd like to add about the Greenbelt and how this body mirrors what happened in 2004, 2005, if there's any color or anything you'd like to add.
I think the only thing I would say is because of the timing for the ballot, with it being November of '22, I chose to take to council different actions earlier, so you'll notice there's a little bit of an inversion here, whereas before with the Greenbelt, the ballot, then the board, and then the plan, but obviously with the start of the consultants last year, and then you all in creation of this board, that was created leading up to the ballot based on what we learned from the last cycle. So other than that, obvious to you all, but a slight inversion in the process. Same intent.
And I think, the reason for some of that pivot is we'll get into this a little bit later with how 2020 went. But I just kind of wanted to go through this and see if there are any questions about, how the Greenbelt was established, how it's sort of framed or structured, and try to address any of those questions or concerns before we get into the real meat of our conversation today, which would be the mill and the ballot language and sort of the history behind that. So before we move on, I just wanted to see if there are any questions about the Greenbelt for staff or for just discussion amongst ourselves. Nope. No takers? Okay, Ms. Jackson.
Yes, I mean, I think it was very helpful to send out this explanation of how the program was established, and I do appreciate that, the referendum came first and then the establishment of the program. I was saying to our chairman, it must be a different time when, voters were trusting the use of their tax dollars, tax dollars on the sales tax side of things, with just the word for financing the cost of green belts. So we're in a different era. I think that's something that we should all take to heart. And that was obviously the outcome of 2020. People didn't really understand or believe that the county had a plan that they could put their taxpayer trust into. So I think the fact that we're doing it like this is the right way to do it in terms of where we are with voters and taxpayers. But going down the sheet and reading about how the program then was established and evolved, I do think that that's the goal that we are heading for. So for me, it's about being able to assure people who care about housing and what the county's money will accomplish with the housing needs in our region, that the Greenbelt program focuses on stated, dedicated criteria by which those awards are then made. It's slightly different in the way that every municipality gets to spend their per capita awards, but even then, they go back through the process of being reviewed and evaluated by the GAB before they're given a green light to spend essentially their own allocations. So I think, that's just a foundation for us to continue to stand on, and it makes a lot of our work easier.
Thank you. Mr. Roden, did you have a?
I was just going to ask how the split and the amounts were established. Did they come up with the mill and what that was going to end up with, and they would spend that money as it came in with these actual digits, or did they create with a plan? We think we'll need this much for these projects, and then we'll have the millage pay for that.
Mr. Rant, can you answer?
Say it one more time.
On the referendum ballot, there's very specific numbers in here, which is great. And I'm just curious, did those come before the split of the projects, or did you create a couple of criteria and figure out what that would cost and then try and get the millage to match that?
Okay, so the split, the way it was spent, and the projects came after the money was collected. So, and that still is the case. We've gone back for a second half-penny sales tax. At the time, for 2004, we bonded it, so we did a lot of projects based on the bonded money. Now we're in a pay-as-you-go. But no matter what, the projects come through a cycle 2 to 3 times a year. They're reviewed by staff and a committee. They go to the board for consideration, then recommendations to council. So no preset projects based on the money.
Thank you.
It was probably more like a half penny was palatable. And then they calculated how much that would bring in, right, over some projection.
Mr. Cheney?
Thanks, Chairman. It seems like the Greenbelt, the GAB has a positive public perception. Yeah, and I think that's critical going into the election to point to something. What I have kind of inferred from this information is that we're going to kind of use this as an example to say this is a model that's worked. We're going to replicate it and educate our folks in the media and voters in a simplistic but truthful way on how we're going to replicate. I think this is a fine model, and if we were to continue to meet after that into, in 5-year increments, update plans, I think this body's staying intact. Unless we're going to solve affordable housing crisis in 5 years, makes plenty of sense. So I would recommend, I think it's a good idea. Thanks staff for bringing this as something we can point to and replicate. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Well, thank you for providing the staff or the Greenbelt structure. Kind of moving on, just to give you a little background about the housing task force and some of those recommendations that came out. We looked at several different municipalities across the country, trying to determine what would be the best model or easy to replicate. Originally, we had intended to the task force recommendation was a 1 mil increase. It was roughly $3.7 million off of that mill that would be created annually. And then we could, from there, fund projects as needed. After that recommendation came, the county council decided that the $3.7 million wasn't quite enough, so they decided to recommend the 2 mil, and that's where we ended up with a 2 mil recommended on the 2020 ballot. Now today, if we were to stay to that, the inflation hasn't happened too much, so you're looking at about 8 million, closer to 8 million, instead of 7.6 or 7.5. So we're kind of still in the same context of 2020, but going forward, we need to kind of think about where we potentially went wrong with the 2 mil increase, and then kind of looking at the Greenbelt structure, what types of clarity can we help to provide? So before we kind of get into ballot language and other goals, the 2 mil seems to be the number that everyone is comfortable with, whether it be conversations with staff or council members. Is everyone here comfortable using that number as what our recommendation to council will be?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Everyone's not? Okay. Yes, sir.
Chairman, yeah, I do think 2 mil is certainly the minimum now. Like as our active projects and by my employer, like costs have gone up
Sure.
50%.
Right.
And so, my memory of the 2020 ballot issue, the millage wasn't part of any conversation.
No.
As far as from council or from the media, as far as there being critiques. And so, I would want to explore what a higher mill, how that might be stomached by the public and by the media and council, importantly, because practically, $8 million annually is good, but, it's not fitting the need of
Sure.
what the consultants have kind of put together. So I don't know where we go from there, but my recommendation is a higher millage than 2 mills.
And council could certainly readjust that number. I mean, because our recommendation was only 1 mil and they countered with 2 mil. So, maybe during that presentation of need and our discussion about where the market is, council could, readjust. I want to make sure that we're okay with that being the floor. And then as these conversations go, and if we want to recommend a higher mill, ultimately it's going to be council who decides what number to land on. I just want to make sure that we're, as a group, comfortable discussing a number and having that be the baseline, at least, for our conversations.
Well, whatever we do, we need to have a basis for why we're recommending it, because that was probably the biggest challenge to the 2020 vote, right? That nobody could explain where they got to the 2 mil and what it would actually be, giving the county as leveraging power. So if we're going to talk about 3 mil instead of 2, then I think we need to get our consultants or our staff to figure out. I mean, obviously that adds, so that's like 12 million a year, right, in round numbers, and it's all about the debt payment, right? We're not going to just give away grant or loan on a revolving loan type fund, $12 million every year. That would not take us anywhere in the housing industry. So we're still talking about using whatever revenue comes in from a millage increase to get to a bigger number that can be invested more strategically. Am I correct on that?
Yes, ma'am. And I think, we'll, especially after the June 8th conversation, we'll have a better idea of, what number we want to settle on. Just for conversation's sake today, I wanted to make sure that we're all comfortable, discussing the 2 mil and if we need to go from there. And Mr. Carney, I see you popped on the screen. Do you have any comment you'd like to throw in about the mill conversation at the moment?
I think the only thing I would say, Mr. Chairman, is just that, when we do our feasibility analysis, the analysis is going to show a significant need. And so, 2 or 3, it's not going to meet the full breadth of the need. And so I think then it is that conversation of, how much in the short term, how much other types of funds could be leveraged, whether it's, large employers, philanthropic, other ways that could come to fund the different pieces. And then I just wanted to, it hasn't come up yet, but it will, of just whether or not, the thought that the mill levy would, kind of, to the question of what is it going to be used for, I think that will be a conversation that we'll have going forward, within the structure of the framework, knowing that, the revenue is one thing, the how you spend it is another, and we can talk about how that is. It all doesn't have to go to a trust fund. It can go to various types of programs, types of tools, and I just wanted to mention that as we move forward. It's a separate conversation, but related, obviously.
Thank you.
And from a data standpoint, I do think, we can talk about mills all day long, but when it comes to the voters, I think knowing what a 3 mil does to the average home
Yes.
price would be very key, because I think if there's magic numbers, right? If it's going to be more than $100 a year, everyone's going to freak out. But if it's $38 versus $48, that might not be a bigger deal. But I think we'll need to know what that equates to before we kind of go too far down those digits. So I think having a minimum is a great idea.
Okay.
Yep.
Great point.
What was it in 2020?
In
$300,000 house.
for a $300,000 house, that equated to $24 annually.
Right.
$8 every $100,000 of value for 2 mills, right? That was the math.
Right. So we're
So yeah, you're still roughly in the same ballpark as 2020. Okay. Any other thoughts on the 2 mil conversation? And
this is kind of a
go ahead.
yeah. Right now we're set on funding this through a 2 mil tax. I mean, there's other ways to fund it, but right now that's where we've narrowed in on. It's from
That's been the sort of directive from council is for us to entertain this, make a recommendation to them. You know, obviously, Mr. Davis and his team are working on the ARPA funds and different programs that are coming in, but we're tasked with looking at alternative ways to bring revenue and dedicate it towards, you know, these types of projects, I should say.
I just didn't know if the consultant had recommended another way to fund it.
I don't believe that's been identified at this point. So, okay. Well, thank you for entertaining all that. I think the real piece of today's conversation is, some of us were part of that 2020 referendum, and I'd like us to have a little conversation about kind of reviewing what happened in 2020, but then also how does that set us up for, what we are here to try and accomplish, and some of the things that we can do to avoid some of those pitfalls. I was part of that, Ms. Hunter and Mr. Cheney, the three of us. So, Mr. Cheney, if you want to start kind of talking about the role that Metanoia played, and then, your kind of thoughts and comments about 2020, and then we'll go down the line with you, Ms. Hunter, and then I'll follow up.
Sure. And Jeremy, you're referencing just the campaign we helped in the referendum itself?
Yes, the referendum, the ballot language, and the questions that came from the community at that time.
Well, I will say, my employers, Metanoia, we helped, along with Josh mentioned other partners, kind of levy support from the public and private community in Charleston County. And Chairman, I don't remember anyone saying no, they wouldn't support it when we approached them, either financially for the campaign piece, or from just as a business or institution. I can't remember very many no's, but I know the actual outcome of the election was different. So that was certainly an interesting data point, but there seemed to be broad support from local businesses, with our campaign team getting great testimonies that we could certainly revisit, real stories, real people, real families in need of housing, and I think from a high level, the whole referendum and ballot language just got assembled fairly quickly, without a consultant, without a plan, without a whole department, and I feel like we'll be in a much better position this round. I don't have any specific feedback to the actual language we used. I know there had been debate whether it would be one question or two questions, and certainly it's important for this body to entertain as we look at the 2022 election. But I feel like if we use the next 2 months well, we can be in a much better position, get much better public perception from the media, and hopefully win the public's trust.
And our organization basically filled in the same way as Duncan mentioned with Metanoia. We hosted town halls with housing trust experts from around the country to inform and educate the community a little bit more. We solicited donations from organizations around the community so that we could support the campaign. And I think that going forward, Charleston County is put together a strategy for this 2022 election, and to kind of piggyback or, be a stair step from what we did in 2020. And hopefully, based on that experience that we had from the previous election, we'll be able to move forward and actually get this approved.
Thank you. Kind of from my seat, I was part of the task force from the beginning, going back to, I believe it was 2018 when those conversations started. And so we went through a lot of the research and trying to figure out best ways to fund these projects and look at them and, start to get something in the pipeline. And then things sort of went dormant. The summer of 2020, there started to be some conversation again about this potentially making the ballot. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of planning, I believe, that went involved. It went to the ballot, and then from there, we were kind of scrambling to develop a campaign and get the supporters and do the necessary legwork to make the campaign successful. And we came within 0.7% of that. But, I ended up talking to, doing a lot of the town halls, talking to a lot of the media, fielding a lot of the questions about this. And to Mr. Cheney's point earlier, it was never a question about the mill or that being, too much of a imposition or not understanding why they were going to be levied a tax increase. There were some questions about the Housing Trust Fund, that element of question one, which I think we need to pay some particular attention to. But the real question came from the obligation of bonds. We weren't prepared as a task force to discuss the $130 million. And so when it was put on the ballot, we really didn't have any answers for the questions that were coming our way with how the $130 million would be spent. I think we've corrected, or the county has corrected in a lot of ways, the mistakes that we went through in 2020, but we can certainly try to learn from that as we move forward. And it wasn't just the people that were inside the campaign that were impacted. All of y'all have mentioned in one way or another, from your particular point of view, how that campaign happened and how the referendum was put forward. So I'd like to use this time to talk about the 2020 language, the campaign, what you talked about with your constituencies about the language and what the particular proposal was, and for us to sort of develop an idea coming out of what the 2020 language was before we get into any particular ballot goals that we'd like for this time around. I'll start at the end. Mr. Logan, if you want to talk a little bit about your point of view in 2020 and any critiques or comments that you may have.
Yes, sir. So I think my only really comment would be definitely just around that question too, around the bonds. When we talk about the general public and their view on this, I think a big part of it, as we mentioned from the beginning, is just kind of educating them on what the language means and why this is important. So, I asked the question, would most of the general public know what a bond was or what a bond would do or how a bond would work? And so I know, of course, it came up whether or not we can have one question on the ballot, whether we can do two questions on the ballot. So I think for me, that was the biggest thing that I kind of heard back, was just around that question too and around the bonding aspect of it. So I would just want us to think long and think around that question and, how we want that to look on the ballot this year. And if we can get around it, is that something that we will want to do? either way, I think just that general education piece around what that means is going to be just critically important.
Thank you. Did you have
Maybe
a comment?
that's question number one. Do we have to have a voter approval of a bond issuance? Is that required by county law?
I believe, yeah.
It is required. Okay.
Mr. Porter, would you?
Yeah, so my thoughts on the 2020 ballot, to John's point, a 2 mil tax. I think I've seen examples of ballot language that would help quantify that and explicitly, write the example in the ballot language saying this equates to $24 a year for a $300,000 home. And furthermore, expected to raise more than 800 or 8 million. I think that's, imperative to quantify those numbers. And then operated by Charleston County, I think it's less important who operates it and more important to where the money's going. I've taken example from Santa Cruz County on their ballot language. They did a good job of saying, we're going to issue this bond that be provided for affordable housing for local workers, including teachers, healthcare workers, service workers, and vulnerable populations, which include people experiencing homelessness, veterans, seniors, and people with disabilities. I know that's makes for a long ballot question, but it gets at, where's the money going?
And I think that's kind of what you touched on is something that we'll revisit in a minute with our 2022 goals. But thank you for the Santa Cruz example. I appreciate that. Mr. Cheney, do you have a comment?
Just to follow up, that's Joe. That's an awesome way to humanize this because that's the problem universally with affordable housing, not just in our community but every community. Is how do you humanize this? How's it going to directly impact families? And putting that language in the ballot question could be a strategy that I see as successful. We saw the school board list these specific projects they were going to fund. And we don't have that option. I understand that would not be feasible, but if we can name people and groups and something we can all agree around, and it's love to know the actual percentage of approval, but humanizing this will get the public support, I think. And if folks remember, the Post and Courier editorial board did support question 1 and did not support question 2. And I think that mixed messaging created an issue for the public. We also, not to complete autopsy, but elected officials were not able to really speak on this like I think they will be this time around, hopefully. I think the champions on council really understand the need now, maybe more so they did in 2020. But humanizing this, I just want to lift that up. That's the winning strategy here, not only in the ballot question, but in our relations with the public.
Yeah, I would just echo that too as well, Duncan. I think having those personal stories, making it applicable to everybody, in a situation where everybody can understand why this is important, why it works. That's, to me, the direction that I think we should go with it.
Okay. Mr. Dukes?
Yeah, I was just going to echo kind of what Duncan and Craig was saying about the humanization point. We often hear common complaints about traffic, and part of the traffic problem is related to people having to drive so far out to be able to go to work where they're not able to live where they work. And understanding that of a cop, I used a cop that I met before. He was essentially not living in North Charleston. He was living out in Morris Corner because he couldn't afford to live. He was doing 45 minutes one way to drive in for a stressful job. And I think that would hammer home the point of who the housing's for, and also try to serve to kind of destigmatize what the housing is going to be used for. We're still fighting that battle.
Thank you. Mr. Redden?
So I had a different experience, and I think some of the folks here. the group that asked us mostly in my office about this actually supported question two. They didn't really have an issue with a bond in general. I think they maybe had more experience with that. But they did have an issue with the fact that the initiatives was just the word initiative, and the organizations that are doing it, it was the county and private or government entities. And so there was no real detail. And on the Greenbelt, it's very clear. I mean, there's a lot of details on, there's a committee involved, and there's a council involved, and there's staff involved. And I know we didn't have staff at the time, but I think the more details you can get there. I mean, we may not be able to say we're going to build 82 neighborhoods and this and that and everything else, but I think being able to add layers of details as far as who's going to be reviewing these and approving these and sorting the disbursements and the plans up, I think would be helpful. You can't build it that detailed. I love the one that Joe has, with who's going to be impacted. That's a great story, which we talked about before. Stories are what influence people, not digits. So having more stories of who the people are and who's going to be helping determine where those funds go, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm sorry to add on to some of the facts that I've learned since this been coming to meetings. Like the average home cost is $560,000. I don't think the average person knows that. And when you hear that number and you think about what they make in a year, and it's like, well, how can a school teacher afford to be able to afford a home here on that type of salary? Things like that I would help hammer home what this is going to be used for.
Thank you. Go, Ms. Jackson, then come back
Okay,
to
go ahead.
Ms. Jackson.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone has already said. I do think that focusing on the people to be served is the main way of communicating the actual need and this opportunity to at least cut into the need. And we will have an adopted plan, and we will have a housing advisory board, steering committee, whatever you want to call us. I think a housing advisory board in favorable comparison to the Greenbelt Advisory Board. However, we can communicate that the two objections that I heard in trying to encourage voters 2 years ago was that, well, how can we trust the county because they've messed up other plans like money, big projects. Everyone cites the Navy hospital, and that's like behind us now, so we don't need to bring that up anymore. That's a success story as long as it took to get there. But then the next objection was, well, what are they going to do with the money? So if we can name that we have now the tools that will help us use the money in a community-oriented process that isn't just, behind closed doors. That's the other criticism that you read about the way that county council operates. They make most of their big decisions, in executive session, and then the community doesn't really even get the benefit of listening to their own thoughts in public. So we will have, county council will have adopted a plan that then will be guided by members of the community in correspondence to the criteria and the funds available. So I don't know, the crafting of a question, some people say that, people are only going to read like 2 sentences and you better keep it short. But I think in this case we should make it as explainable and understandable as we can humanly do on a ballot.
Thank you. Ms. Hunter?
I'm echoing.
Oh,
Well, at this point, I'm kind of echoing what everyone else has already said, but just to kind of summarize and wrap it up, Josh, if you don't mind, or Mr. Chairman, we're going to be educating the community and the public through bonds of question number 2 and humanizing the need through storytelling. But I also wanted to make sure that we're still including those numbers because there's a certain group of people where that appeals to, who understand numbers. They're going to want to know that. So I think that we need to make sure that we're including the storytelling and making sure that we have those actually hard numbers in there as well.
okay. Well, thank you. One of the things that was pointed out to me post-election and was the inclusion of specific wording. the local housing trust fund being specifically mentioned in question 1 creates some issues that I think were unintended when the ballot was written. But we want to be as clear and transparent as possible. I think that's been the overall message. But at the same time, we don't want to specifically limit ourselves,
Right.
because whatever is listed in question 1, that's the only purpose or use going forward. So as we think about, as we move into the next conversation piece, we need to be very cognizant about what we are recommending to council, because once this recommendation leaves, it doesn't come back to us for review. We don't get first opportunity to review what legal rights. Our recommendation goes to legal, and that goes on to council. So I want us to be very, very deliberate in this conversation, and we don't have to come to a conclusion today. We can revisit this at our June 22nd meeting, which I actually think, from a timing purpose, we'll have the consultant's report on the 8th, and then I think that will really give us the clarity to make a sound recommendation on the ballot language. But I just wanted to highlight that about the 2020 recommendation, was that there was an inherent flaw in this recommendation. And so as we move into another discussion, I just wanted to be clear about that. We can kind of get into what housing initiatives we would like to see. We can humanize and talk about the people that would qualify. But I think the more we get into the weeds of revolving loan funds or a housing trust fund, or a certain percentage needs to be used for rehabilitation, those things really handicap the potential of the mill. So just as more of a disclaimer as anything else, I just wanted to put that out there, that as we have these next couple conversations, just keep this in mind about what's on the ballot really handcuffs what council and staff are able to do. And if there's no other discussion about 2020, I would like to move into the ballot goals for this year. Obviously, we've been talking about it for quite some time now. We have an opportunity here to make a recommendation to council, but this recommendation is going to be part of a bigger plan. It's not like we did it in 2020, where we're just making this recommendation and coming back to fill in the details. We're going to be doing multiple things at the same time here. And so staff has indicated we're going to have to entertain the bond as well as the mill conversation. So that's a piece of it that we'll have to explain later. But at this time, just know that it is something that we're going to have to consider. This is a package, so to speak, with question 1 and question 2. So with the recommendation, we mentioned that the 2 mil would be the baseline. I think once Miriam and Justin and everyone come back on the 8th and really give us a briefing, we'll be able to know, does that recommendation need to be higher or stay the same? But as far as kind of building off of what Mr. Porter gave us with the was it Santa Cruz example, what types of things would you like to see in question 1, so that we can start to think about how do we want to populate that question and send that on? would it be inappropriate to have, does staff have any thought or input at this time on this conversation, or would you rather us just talk?
I'll let you guys talk first.
Okay. All right. So, we can kind of start to brainstorm, how do we want this to be structured? You mentioned the human element. We need to make sure that we're capturing as much as possible. So keep that in consideration as we list what we would like to see in the question. And Ms. Cheney, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe before we discuss the language, since I understand the bonding is now going to be required, maybe we can have a really high-level explanation of how that would work. So how the bonding works. So this whole body understands like how bonds work. Basically, how if this passes, what is the county going to do next? Because I think the issue is not so much in the language as the issue in the 2020 was people are explaining the language differently.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so if we could start right now with the staff, or Chairman, if you want to explain how the bond will work, and maybe then we can kind of talk through the language or the proposed language. But can we get an explanation on the bond and how that would work?
Make a clarification first. The bonding is not required, but voter approval is required if you're doing the bond. I think that's how.
No, that's helpful. I mean, that's where that's great. So let's say this passes. What does Charleston County do then in regards to the bonding?
Okay, so if the money were going to be bonded, and first of all, I don't think that bonding of the full amount would be feasible from an implementation standpoint, because I believe we would have 5 years to spend the money that was bonded. And I don't know that we would be able to fund, $130 million. Well, first of all, let's go back a little bit. Essentially, what you're doing is borrowing against future revenue. And so there's interest to be paid. So if we were raising $160 million over 20 years, I believe it would work out to about $130 million if the entire amount were bonded. The remainder of that would go towards interest. And then we would have to spend that down in 5 years. And so I don't believe that bonding of the full amount was actually proposed by anybody. I'm not sure. But clearly some portion of that folks were thinking about bonding. So whatever that number would actually be. And so if the referendum passes, it would essentially be 2 years before we would actually have money to spend, because it would take about a year to go through whatever process, and then a year to actually collect the money. And I do believe that in some instances that money can be spent as it's collected or before so it could be as little as 1 year. There's some technicalities there I still don't understand, but it would be between 1 and 2 years before there would actually be money going out the door. If it were bonded, obviously that time period would be shortened. We would borrow against that money, and then we should not borrow more than we think we could spend in the 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then the remainder of that would, of course, be collected over time.
Daryl, where's the 5 years come from? I don't see
That's what I've been told.
I think this is such a complex subject. I would be more comfortable with our financial advisors speaking to you all, because this is not a simple thing.
Yes.
And
Good point.
As you saw, Richmond County referendum language, and what happens can result in a county owing millions of dollars back because they didn't follow the language precisely. So I think to have that, I think the best thing to do would be to have the financial CPAs and the financial folks speak to you all. Once you all get to the point, Josh, like I told you, if you all want to do something different, I want them to come back and evaluate what even the county can do in terms of its capacity, because we have certain state law limits and things that we work within. So I don't feel equipped to give you a fully truthful answer that I'm certain will be right.
We can try to arrange to have someone who can give some more detailed information. I'm assuming we can get them for next meeting, maybe? So we'll work on that, getting them here to answer specific questions for the next meeting.
Or if you put together your specific questions and get them
Okay.
displayed us, then we can get an answer whether they can be here or not.
But,
So we draw your specific questions.
but at a very high level, let's say this passes, county staff would determine what that amount of the bond would be appropriate, and we go to like municipal bond market and get a loan. Essentially, is what a bond is, right? It's like essentially what we're talking about. And I just think that this body really needs to understand how that function is before we kind of move forward, because as I recall, the second question was kind of a surprise to us last time around, and we were not equipped. So, but yeah, I think that would be welcome certainly before the 24th meeting, if we could get some just explanation of how this would work. We really need to understand that. If it's 130 or if it's whatever the number is, we just need to really be prepared to explain that and how we got to that number.
And I think we should not, it's really not a loan. Basically, you're selling to the bond investor market the value of your credit, your
Future
credit
revenue?
worthiness,
Right.
and then agreeing to pay them a rate of return to the extent that it looks like an interest payment.
Right.
But basically, you're saying to whoever's going to invest in the county's municipal bonds that you are going to be good for the 130 million, and in exchange for that, you're going to give them an annual rate of return that they can take to the bank while you're paying off the principal. We start talking to the public about it as a loan, I think that, already earns us a negative
Yeah.
sort of, reaction, so.
I think the talking points need to be.
Having a bond expert.
Yeah.
would be
The talking
really
points need to be Mr. Porter's point about the human aspect for sure. That's where we need to direct our messaging, but in the event that we get asked, we don't
Right.
need deer in the headlights. We need a quick answer.
Oh, we definitely
Something,
need the answers.
all speaking the same language.
Does the county have one bond attorney or an investor relationship, or do they? No?
Council just took some action just this week to select bond counsel, so, see what that is, they just put it last time.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so going back to goals that we would like to see accomplished, we'll get some clarity with question 2 in general, but I think question 1 is what we really need to focus on, and how we want to direct that recommendation to legal for them to write the proposed ordinance, proposed referendum. So, as we go through, Mr. Porter listed the people that would be impacted. Is this something that we think, having sort of the downstream people who would be touched by this, we want to include this as much as possible in the language?
I think we should cut and paste the ordinance he read. I mean, it sounded good to me.
Yeah.
Putting in the details about what it would cost for an average,
Definitely,
price homeowner tax increase. I think that's a good message. I tried to use that whenever I could. We were only talking about $24 a year. You spend, $24 a month at Starbucks, most people. So that kind of making it all relative, and then the people to serve. I think those are the two, in my opinion, the two main aspects of what people were questioning. Why should they think about this?
Okay.
And to build on that, I'll say, collectively, my $24 a year, as a county-wide, now we're talking 8 million.
Right.
And to fast forward to question 2, the ability to, the brief lesson on what a bond is and how it allows the county to leverage those funds to increase the pot of money, I think would be a good connection between question one and question two.
Okay. Yes, sir, Mr. Roden.
So we had a board meeting last week, and I presented, unofficially, but the presentation we received from the consultants. And the one thing that everybody's jaw dropped was when we got to the slide where it says basically 85% of our population can't afford the typical house. So, something kind of broad to start the sentence off with, which would include our residents like firefighters and
First
teachers.
responders, all that,
So
right.
I think when we're talking about digits, I think you're right. I think people are looking for actual objective numbers, and I don't know which one of those are most appropriate, but I think having a mix of the digits and as well as the stories, I think would be helpful and to open up that paragraph. And I do worry that the more you add, although it sounds like it's effective, but the more you add, I don't know how many people get lost in a ballot, as they're standing there.
Right, it's a
So I know you don't want to go too long and too deep, but I do think you're going to need a lot of personal touches in there to attach it to people.
I mean, ideally, we'd be educating everybody ahead of time, so when they got there, they just vote yes. That's the
That's
ideal.
good point.
Yeah.
Last year, or in 2020, I think our slogan was vote yes on both questions. And
It was.
Yeah.
I remember seeing
Say that again.
signs.
it was vote yes on both questions, and that was just the plain language, but what does vote yes mean?
Right.
So
Yeah.
hopefully if we do our due diligence on the front end, we won't have to worry about that and we can still keep it kind of short and sweet. I know you'd prefer that, Mr. Chairman, but I think that we're going to have to include that language.
Okay. Any other thoughts or inclusions that we need to be considering as this conversation moves forward?
I do think that, and I think Ms. Jackson mentioned it too, I do think that there's a trust factor. So, somehow in there you want to put who's deciding where this money's going would be helpful. I don't know if you call the committee out specifically, but, some language on.
So I think that's where I'll jump in now.
Yeah, please.
And I think based on our conversation with developers, based on our conversation with members of the committee, et cetera, I think the staff recommendation will eventually come down to, it'll boil down to the language saying something about this money is to support the plan.
Right.
Number one, that language says there is a plan and folks can go someplace and find it.
Right.
And number two, there's a couple of things that came up here where I think flexibility would be absolutely critical, particularly if we're talking about bonding a portion of this money. Even if it were $50 million and we were finding out, boy, we're having trouble spending this based on this narrow set of rules, we would be completely out of luck if we were tied to specific language in the referendum. But if the referendum says this money is to pay for this plan, then that gives, by amending the plan, we give ourselves whatever flexibility we need. So that's the only thing that we would be pushing for, is that the ballot language say that this money is to pay for this plan.
Yeah, that's the little note that I made a while ago, that, it's going to fund initiatives established by the 2022 County Housing Plan as overseen by X, Y, and Z.
Well, is there a way to package that into, I love the housing our future tagline. I mean, can we just package it into a program or say, to house our future, or, the housing our future plan or program or bond or act?
I think that's smart.
Okay. These conversations are getting easier than I anticipated. I was expecting a lot more debate. So if there's anything else that we have on this specific issue with regards to ballot language, I think we've given staff enough to work on the next couple weeks and come back to us. We can come up with our questions that we have for the finance folks that we would like addressed. I'm not sure that we have time to squeeze them into a potential meeting. But if we could get all that in writing in the next couple of weeks, would that be adequate for everyone? Okay. And if we need to bring them in for whatever reason, we can revisit that, but just, okay. We will work on that in the next few weeks. And then I think the biggest piece that, the success or failure of these, 2 questions are really going to rely on the framework and how we develop that plan and what that plan and presentation looks like. I know Mr. Carney and Ms. Keller will be here in a couple weeks, but if y'all are still around and can hop on for a few minutes, would you mind giving us an update on kind of where we are and what you need from us prior to the meeting on the 8th?
You bet. Thank you. Can I just say this conversation has been great to listen to. Miriam and I have been chatting while you all have been talking, and I think it's clarifying some things that we'll definitely talk about on June 8th and can help to set the table for your June 22nd meeting. And I think we've got just some quick hits today that Miriam will walk you through and invite any questions before our visit. But we'll be very excited to continue the conversation you all have had today when we get there. Miriam, I think we've got a few slides to share if we can.
Yeah, great. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So just a super quick reminder about the schedule for the Housing Our Future plan, kind of at a glance. So as Diamond and Margaret were describing earlier, this is kind of how we're teeing into the engagement that was discussed. So we had a lot of great stakeholder roundtables early on, and we are continuing with lots of discussions and interviews in the last couple of weeks, in particular, to understand kind of the development economics and how that will influence how far resources could go supporting affordable housing development. And then, as we discussed last time, planning ahead to community workshops in advance of that draft plan in late September, early October, that will be very, very detailed, so the full kit and caboodle, if you will, available for everybody in the community to dive into. And then we'll also have some kind of short versions of that. So people, say maybe they don't want to read 70 or more pages, that won't be the expectation. It'll be accessible for people really to get into, and we can describe more what that means at that time. And then what we will be presenting on the 8th at the next meeting is the strategic framework that will be kind of refining through June so that it is ready to accompany this recommendation of the referendum language. Just a couple of quick pictures of how we're thinking about what that framework is going to entail. So, at the very end of our presentation of housing needs, we kind of put this slide up there, which is just to say, there are so many different tools available that the county could consider to support new housing development, housing preservation, access, stability, capacity, and a broad number of ways of funding that work. I hope the audience is okay. I'm getting a little bit of feedback.
You're fine.
It's okay? Okay, great. So as part of this framework, what we're going to be working on for that initial strategic framework in advance of the big plan is two things. And the first being, what are the priority tools kind of organized within goals? A trust fund being one of them, but, among several others, and kind of an initial sense of what would be, immediate action priorities, then short-term priorities, medium-term priorities, say over the next 2 to 3 years, and then longer-term priorities, 3 years plus. So kind of laying out some of these things, and we'll have, a bit of detail about each of these priority tools. And that will really be the subject of that June 8th meeting, to see, which from the committee's perspective ought to really rise to the top in the context of some of this information about how far resources could go in, different formats. So that will be one big piece. And then the other is laying out kind of the possible sources and supports, just as a starting point, understanding that the mill levy and referendum is, one among, several available supports and resources. Of course, this is kind of the most immediate thing. But as part of the kind of holistic, comprehensive picture, we want to sort of keep in mind the long-term game here about building on early successes to for example leverage funds to build more support with the philanthropic community or whatever other types of opportunities there may be, and so start to lay out those options. Justin, have I missed any key points here?
No, I don't think so. I think, just between the two slides, I think you're getting a sense of what the framework, and it will be a framework. I think it's important for us to just say that it'll be a framework to give context so that people understand sort of the distinction between the mill levy and possible bonding and a possible trust fund. And it's easy to conflate those three items, even though they're really separate but related, right? And so I think what we're trying to do with these two slides is, denote that within this framework, we'll be able to talk about priority tools and what they can accomplish and the duration and timeline of that. And then switching to, okay, everyone should know that within this framework, the mill levy is only one of a broader set of revenue pieces. And so as Miriam and I and the team, on our end, we're trying to conceptualize, we felt like these two slides just sort of really started to kind of set that information in that sort of 1-2 punch so that people would understand, kind of the differences, the way we're looking at them. And then this creates a very, I think, understandable kind of arrow pointing at what the final plan is going to look like that we will be working with all of you in the community and the staff on, over July, August, September, of what that final document's going to do. And I think this creates a roadmap for that in a good way and for the conversations that we need to have. So no, I think that's a lot of what we're trying to accomplish with this framework. And I think one of the things that I would say is, yes, this is also a framework. We're going to have more information behind this for our June 8th meeting. And if there's questions that come out of that, that we can easily answer and turn around some information before your second June meeting, that's our goal. That's what we'll do. And you'll be able to move the ballot piece forward. And then I think the only other thing I would just sort of emphasize is that this framework is the starting point, and it's really to get you all and the county council in a position of understanding where that arrow is pointed, where we're going with the plan, knowing that we will continue to flesh this out and have community conversations around this planning effort. And so we won't be lobbying for the mill levy, right? And staff won't be doing that, but we will be producing more information and more detail that then could be put off into whatever sort of messaging that the partners on that sort of, I'll call it the political side rather than the planning side, would want. And so, I think it's just important to kind of set that expectation. The framework will be there. Everyone should see where we're going, and then we'll continue to develop that while the community is talking about the ballot language. We'll be talking about the plan. And I think that'll be hopefully a whole lot more than you had in 2020.
Yeah.
And some of the things that we were talking about, previously, as y'all kind of develop this and we kind of make this recommendation going forward with ballot language, how timeline wise, when will be? I know you said that it'll start with framework and structure, but when will when do you anticipate some more of the meat being applied to the bones and us being able to clearly articulate what the plan is and what the strategy is going forward? For when as we get closer to November and those questions arise, can you give us a little clarity on that piece of it?
Miriam, not to put you on the spot, I don't know, do we have our other schedule slide handy to share that might help?
The more detailed one.
Yep. And we may not, if you just want to, I mean, we can just talk about it.
It was on the one she showed us earlier.
This is the one I have kind of close at hand.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, what you're describing is what is that, that draft plan that has all of the meat.
Early October.
And early October, late September. Now, how we had been thinking about it is that it would be great to have had several community workshops before this draft plan is published so that that community input would be then directly incorporated into the plan. It's possible that this happens a little more simultaneously, where the workshops are both collecting feedback on the draft plan, informing the plan, and we're communicating about what's in the draft plan. I think there are a couple of different approaches, and in the latter, we could push to have this out a little bit earlier. Those were some of the considerations there.
Okay. Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Justin or Miriam? Thanks, guys, and I appreciate you staying on during our rambling session on ballot language. But
Bring
thank
your
you.
flip-flops. It's going to be hot.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds good. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Thanks, guys. All right. Before we adjourn, does anyone have any final comments about what we discussed today? I think we have enough to go give staff some follow-up items and kind of be prepared. I will say, unfortunately, I have to be out of town for our June 8th meeting, but Ms. Hunter will be running the show, and I'm sure we'll have everything under control. But just as far as attendance goes, we will need a quorum for those of us who are going to miss. I think I'm going to be on virtually, but I think having Justin and Miriam's presentation next time is going to be essential to kind of how our June 22nd meeting goes. But other than that, those are really the only housekeeping notes I had. Ms. Hunter, do you have any?
No, we're good.
Okay. Without any other further business, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Meeting's adjourned. Thank you, guys.
We're not going to take any votes on next meeting. We'll just give the feedback to the strategic framework.
Yes, ma'am.